Okay, I didn't do a lot, but just while on break, I just added here this date of birth between two text boxes, one called txt start and txt end, right? So I added that to the interface. While I'm at it though, if I'm going to be searching the date of birth, I want to give a nice format here. It's just bugging me that we haven't formatted the date time. So if I come down to edit columns, go to the date of birth, you know how to do this already. Data format string, give it the 1 for short date, 0:D for short date, curly brace, just as shown down here in the help, right? Just that way, it just gives it that way all the time. Okay, so I know I now want to filter as well for date of birth between one date and another. And how this should work is if I leave one blank, then basically, you know, if I just put an end date, then anything up to that end date should be included. Vice versa if I just put a start date. If I put both, then it has to be between them both, right? Okay, so now I'll have to modify my stored procedure to make that work then. So let me come back down here to my patient, select by X, select by multiple, and I need to make a further change or a few changes here, right, for this to work. So first of all, I need some additional parameters, one for each value for the range for date of birth. So I'll put a comma at, I don't know, start, I guess. And remember, varchar, however big we need for a date. Since we aren't worrying about time values, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 is probably enough. If you want to add a couple more, feel free. But I think 10 should do it. And again, oh, single quotes, David, I'm doing TSQL. What am I thinking? All right, so same thing for at end. So I assume I'm not going to be past anything but an empty string. Okay, so now I have my start and end values there. But before I'm ready to do the select, remember we talked about what we need to do is if you only get one or the other instead of both, then we have to check and substitute to make the date range work properly the oldest possible date for the start date if we don't have one, and vice versa for the newest possible start date. So if my at start, thankfully IntelliSense is there, equals an empty string, then I'm going to substitute. So I'll SAMP to set. Remember, you are working in TSQL here. Set or select to assign a value to a variable. At start equal to, and if you go to help system, you can quickly find out, as I said, the oldest date in the system that it supports is 0001 0101. Right? We'll do the same thing for the ending date parameter. If, well, I can even copy paste a little bit since I'm so bad at typing. So it's at end. If that's an empty string, at end will be the most futuristic possible date the system supports, which is 999/12/31. So again, the logic here is we'll take an empty string. We don't have to specify a starting or ending date, right? If you don't supply either, then we'll just define the range as the maximum and minimum date there can be. In other words, every record will be included then. So that's like our flag value. Okay, it means anything after this would be included. If we don't give an end date, everything up to this would be included. So in other words, all dates will be included, right? So that essentially gives us our all functionality. If we pass one or the other, then we'll just substitute the maximum ranges. So it'll be everything up to or from a given date. So that's it. So that gets my ranges set up. Just before, though, I do the actual between, in my where clause, I have to convert the data type. Text was best for passing the parameter values, but I need to actually come in there and set it properly. So it does involve a little bit of work here in code. I have to actually declare variables. Yes, thank you very much. So declare I'll maybe call it start date because this is going to be an actual date data type. Okay, so we have at date, sorry, at start date and at end date. So just make those two variables, and then I will cast these strings into them, right? So if I did get values from the client user interface, then I'm not changing them here, because only if they're empty strings do I change them. Okay, so now we have to do a couple of sets. Set at start date. Cast works simple for this. I could do convert, but cast works fine. At start. As date. And then the same thing for the end date. Now that looks like a lot of code, but it's all necessary to think about it logically. Okay, we start with empty optional parameters, just assume an empty string. If a real value isn't given, then we substitute the maximum ranges. If the real value is given, we just work with it, and then we convert it to dates, and now we're ready to actually add to the where clause. Again, we use and, because we're further narrowing down by the more criteria we specify, right? So my field is date of birth between at start date and at end date. Okay, so that gives the whole procedure. I'll just do an update the database. So now it's set up to look for additional parameters. I have the text boxes ready to go. So I just need to run the configuration wizard again on my data source. Same procedure, but now I have two more parameters, each of which will come from a control. So my start comes from my txt start. My end comes from txt end. But don't forget, these are text values, so for both of them I have to come in here and change this boolean. So that's end. Make sure I do the same thing for start, because I need to pass the empty strings for all three of those. Good. Should be good. And finish. Alright, so now I should be ready to test for all that, so we'll just bring her up. Okay. Oh, well, there's one thing. I forgot that the date of birth is nullable here, right? So it's not including anything that's null. We'll deal with that in our next video. But for now, here, let me just, oh, I didn't turn on sorting. Well, I can see I've only got a few dates. A couple in the 1960s, 1990, right? So let's just try an end date of 1970, okay? 1970. So if anything up to that date. So the 60s one should be included, the 90s one should be excluded, and there we go. So it worked, right? I can just test my clear button, puts everything back. So let's say everything after 1989. January the 1st. So just the 1990s ones are there. Okay, so if I were to say between let's let's see, 65. So that's supposed to be a 9. 1965, January the 1st. And 1990, February 10th. Right? Then I should leave out the 1964, and I should leave out this one that was February 28th, 1990, because that's past the 10th. So I should just have those two records, and I do. So I can see it's working with two dates, or one or the other date. All right. Now one thing I might mention though is, obviously if I put garbage in here, okay, conversion failed, right? So really doing this kind of a filter form, I should have what? What should I add to make sure that data entered here is in the right format? Exactly. I need some validation controls. Now, it's not a required situation because I don't have to have anything, but if I do put it in, it has to be make sure that it's a valid date, right? So there's a couple ways I could go about doing that. But you know, just a quick validation control. I can come over here, stick on a compare. Come down to validation. Throw a compare control. Error message. Start date must be a valid date. Control to validate is my txt start. And this one, I'm just making sure that if there's something there, it is a valid date, right? So my type will just be date. And the operator, I'm not comparing it to anything. I'm just doing a data type check. And that star then will show up if it's not a valid date. I'm going to put 1 as well after the second text box. And it will be slightly different, although I'll also use a compare validator. And so my error message will be end date must be a valid date later than the start date. So I can use it to do both. I can actually check that it is an actual date and at the same time make sure that they're in the right order, that the start date is before the end date, right? So control to validate is txt end. Control to compare is my txt start. So I'll compare the value to the start date. Data type is date. And it has to be greater than or equal to. Okay. And that should handle the validation of the dates being put in. If they're blank, then it won't be a problem, because that's how the logic of the control works. So if I put in garbage, I don't have my validation summary, but you can see the stars showing up. It's not a valid date, right? 1989. It accepts that, even though this is blank, but still this is after, right? So that is fine. If I try to put something in here, maybe I'll put 65. Then my star is showing up. If I showed the full message, it would be saying that it's not after, right? So I have my start date before my end date, okay, which is just not allowed. There we go. And that should be allowed. And we just get the two that are in between those dates. Greater than or equal to. Okay. So that's a little better. I don't need really validation here because it's allowed to be null, so there's nothing really more I could validate there. But you can see we could take this further. We could add more You know, say for text in the first name contains, anywhere contained, and so on. We could just keep on adding more and more filters and just set them up appropriately. But I think that's a good introduction. We have a fully functioning, multiple, dynamically filtered list of patients. All right, we'll take this further, but this is good enough for now.